Power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it bows its head. It says, yes. It nods. It obeys. And that is the most dangerous deception of all. You were taught that obedience makes you good, that silence makes you safe, that following rules will protect you. But the truth is darker. Obedience was never created to protect you. It was designed to control you, to turn your instincts into submission and your intelligence into compliance. Because the world doesn't reward the obedient, it rewards the useful. And when you stop being useful, no one cares how loyal you've been. In this video, we'll uncover the psychology behind obedience, the illusion of control that keeps you quiet, the manipulation tactics that train your mind to serve, and the Machiavellian truth about why real power begins only when you stop obeying. We'll dissect how people weaponize guilt to keep you docile, how society teaches obedience as virtue, and how to break that invisible leash without losing your humanity. By the end, you'll see obedience not as morality but as strategy, a mask, a tool, a lie you were programmed to believe. So, if you've ever felt trapped by duty, crushed under someone else's authority, or guilty for saying, no, this is your mirror. Because what you call obedience might just be fear wearing discipline's face. Let's begin. Here's the cruel truth: most people never question obedience because it feels safe. Disobedience, that's dangerous. It isolates you. It turns you into the outcast, the rebel, the problem. So people learn to bow before they even understand why. They think compliance will protect them, but it only makes them easier to control. From the moment you could walk, you were told to listen. At home, obedience was love. At school, obedience was intelligence. At work, obedience became survival. And somewhere between childhood and ambition, you forgot what freedom felt like. Because here's what they don't tell you: every system built around power needs obedience to survive. Governments, corporations, religions, relationships, they all depend on one unspoken contract. You stay quiet, and we'll give you purpose. You follow the script, and we'll call you good. But the truth is, obedience doesn't create peace, it creates control. It's how people are made predictable, and predictability is the death of power. Think about it. The ones who rule you, manipulate you, or shame you into silence aren't gods. They're just people who learned how to weaponize obedience. They use your need for approval against you. They make you crave permission before you even move, and you mistake that paralysis for discipline. You see it in relationships, the partner who says, "If you loved me, you'd do this." You see it in offices, the boss who says, "Be a team player." You see it in families, the parent who says, "Don't talk back." Each command sounds harmless, but each one trains your mind to equate silence with safety. That's the real lie. Because obedience doesn't build peace, it kills resistance. And without resistance, you stop growing. The ancient philosophers understood this. They knew that blind obedience was the death of reason. That morality without questioning turns into slavery. Machiavelli himself once wrote that fear is a stronger bond than love because fear commands obedience. And once fear controls you, you no longer need chains. Your mind becomes the prison. When you obey out of fear, you think you're surviving, but you're only preserving someone else's power. And that's what this video is truly about: reclaiming your mind from that invisible authority. We'll explore how obedience was engineered, how cultures, systems, and even relationships thrive on submission, and how to reverse engineer it without turning into chaos. Because rebellion without control is just noise. But rebellion with purpose, that's evolution. Most people don't want to hear that. They want the illusion of peace more than the discomfort of truth. They want to obey and still call it freedom. That's why the powerful never have to shout. They simply let obedience do the work. But if you've reached a point where silence feels heavier than words, where yes feels like self-betrayal, then you're ready for this truth. You're ready to unlearn obedience. You're ready to see how the game was built and how to stop playing by their rules. Because once you see obedience for what it really is, manipulation disguised as morality, you'll start noticing the patterns everywhere. You'll see it in how leaders demand loyalty but never give respect. You'll see it in how people praise submission as virtue but secretly despise the submissive. And you'll realize obedience doesn't earn you love. It earns you invisibility. When you obey too much, you disappear. Your opinions fade. Your boundaries blur. Your soul becomes a script someone else wrote for you. And that's the tragedy of obedience. It kills individuality under the illusion of order. But don't mistake this for chaos. Real power isn't found in rebellion for its own sake. It's found in strategic disobedience, the kind that looks calm on the surface but burns with awareness inside. The kind that smiles when told, obey, and quietly chooses its own path. In the next parts of this video, we'll go deep into how obedience is programmed, how guilt and shame keep you submissive, and how to break that pattern using cold psychological detachment, not anger, not pride, but precision. You'll learn why obedience is rarely about respect and almost always about leverage. You'll see the hidden psychology behind authority, conformity, and the manipulation of moral identity. And most importantly, you'll understand how to reclaim your voice without destroying your peace. Because power doesn't mean shouting. It means knowing when silence is choice, not surrender. They trained you to equate peace with obedience. They said the calm you feel when you stop resisting is freedom. But it isn't peace, it's sedation, a drug injected into your mind by those who benefit from your compliance. Here's the truth, they'll never say aloud. They don't want you calm because you're wise. They want you calm because you're controllable. You can't rebel if you're comfortable. And so, they teach you that questioning is arrogance, that silence is maturity, that submission is strength. They dress obedience in moral clothing, and you wear it proudly, never realizing it's a collar. This is the first conflict of the obedient mind, the war between comfort and clarity. The moment you start to see the machinery behind authority, your comfort begins to rot. You sense something wrong, but your entire body revolts at the thought of breaking away. Because obedience isn't just external, it's emotional. It doesn't hold your hands, it holds your guilt. When you were young, you were rewarded for doing what you were told. Every good job, every well done, every smile was a transaction. You learned that love was conditional, that safety was earned through surrender. And in that moment, obedience fused itself to your identity. You stopped asking, "Is this right?" You started asking, "Will they still love me if I say no?" That's how obedience becomes invisible, not through force, but through affection. They never need to threaten you when they can simply withhold approval. You crave validation, and they use that craving like a leash. It's the softest prison ever built, one where the bars are made of praise. And this is where most people lose the war. They confuse peace with absence of conflict, not realizing that obedience itself is the conflict. It's the war between your need for belonging and your hunger for truth. And most people choose belonging because truth costs too much. Here's the cruel twist. The obedient rarely see themselves as slaves. They call it loyalty. They call it humility. They call it faith. They wrap their submission in noble words to make it bearable. But every time you silence yourself for the sake of peace, a part of you dies quietly. And one day, that silence becomes permanent, not because someone forced it upon you, but because you stopped believing your voice mattered. Obedience doesn't need chains, it needs belief. That's why systems don't crush the disobedient immediately. They isolate them. They let society shame them first. They let friends withdraw. They let families whisper. Until you start to think, maybe they were right, maybe obedience is safety. You start to question yourself instead of the world. You wonder if you're the problem for wanting freedom. You confuse self-respect with rebellion, and rebellion with sin. That's how deep this programming runs. And the deeper you look, the more terrifying it gets, because obedience has many faces. Sometimes it wears the smile of love. Sometimes the mask of professionalism. Sometimes it calls itself morality. But it always whispers the same thing. Don't make noise. Don't make them uncomfortable. Stay small. Look closely, and you'll see that obedience is the silent language of fear. Every culture, every empire, every religion has depended on it. The pharaohs demanded it. The kings enforced it. The corporations now market it. It's the same chain, just polished for a modern age. They don't need to strike you anymore. They just label you difficult, uncooperative, disrespectful. Those words are the new whips. And people run from them faster than from actual pain. Think about how easy it is to control a crowd. You don't need to shout at 1,000 people. You only need to make them police each other. You train them to fear being different. You make obedience a social currency and rebellion a stigma. Soon, they enforce their own cages. The obedient man thinks he's noble because he follows orders. The obedient woman thinks she's safe because she doesn't question. But both are prisoners, polite, quiet, self-disciplined prisoners. Here's something you've probably never heard. Obedience has nothing to do with morality. It's about hierarchy, about maintaining power structures that depend on your silence. You can be obedient and evil. You can be disobedient and righteous. History is full of both. The obedient soldiers who just followed orders. The obedient citizens who turned away while injustice burned. The obedient lovers who stayed silent through betrayal. The obedient children who never spoke against abuse. Obedience doesn't make you good. It makes you useful to whoever defines good. That's the second conflict, the war between love and power. Because every time love demands obedience, it becomes power disguised as affection. And every time power rewards obedience, it creates love that depends on fear. It's a cycle, one that feeds itself endlessly. But here's the most disturbing truth. You don't need someone else to control you anymore. You've learned to obey yourself. You hear their voices in your own head, the parents, the teachers, the leaders, and you enforce their rules internally. You hesitate before speaking, second-guess before deciding, apologize before acting. That's how they win. Even when they're gone, they live inside you. Their control has become your conscience. When that realization hits, it's brutal. You start to notice how many of your choices are shaped by invisible authority. You notice how often you shrink your tone, moderate your truth, avoid confrontation. You realize you've mistaken politeness for virtue and fear for peace. Here's what they don't tell you. You can obey out of fear, or you can obey out of calculation. One makes you weak, the other makes you powerful. When obedience is a conscious strategy, a mask you wear to observe, adapt, and strike. When the time is right, it becomes a weapon, not a wound. But when obedience is emotional, when you need it to feel safe, it becomes a leash that you'll never see. So, the question isn't, should you obey? The question is, why you obey. Is it fear, guilt, habit, or strategy? Because obedience without awareness is slavery. But obedience with awareness is control. That's the paradox. You can use the same behavior, silence, restraint, patience, and either be enslaved or empowered by it. It depends on whether you chose it or someone else chose it for you. And that's where the real transformation begins, when obedience stops being an unconscious habit and becomes a deliberate act of power. But to reach that state, you first have to confront the architecture of your conditioning. You have to look your inner authority in the eye and say, "I see you. You don't own me anymore." Only then can you move from being the obedient to being the observer. Once you see obedience for what it is, you can't unsee it. It's like noticing the strings on a puppet show. Suddenly, every movement looks fake. Every rule feels suspicious. Every authority sounds rehearsed. You begin to realize that obedience is not a virtue, it's a weapon disguised as one. It's how society keeps its chaos quiet, how power maintains its illusion of order, and you, the obedient one, were never part of that order. You were just part of its stability, a predictable piece in someone else's game. But here's the shocking part. Most people don't want to wake up from obedience, because awakening means responsibility. It means no longer having someone to blame. When you're obedient, every failure is someone else's fault. When you're free, every failure is yours. Freedom is heavier than control. That's why so few people carry it. The obedient man lives with rules. The awakened man lives with consequences. One is simple. The other is terrifying. But only one is real. This is the stage where your world starts to fracture. You'll lose comfort before you gain clarity. You'll lose people before you gain peace. Because disobedience doesn't just threaten systems, it threatens relationships built on illusion. When you stop obeying, you stop feeding egos. And those who relied on your submission will turn against you. You'll be called arrogant, cold, ungrateful, rebellious. And they'll mean every word, because your liberation is their loss of control. You were their mirror, the proof that obedience works. But the moment you break free, you expose their weakness. You become living proof that submission was never necessary, and that terrifies them. This is where most people retreat. They mistake rejection for wrongness. They think, if everyone's turning on me, maybe I'm doing something bad. But here's the reality. Every system defends itself when threatened. Every structure punishes rebellion before it even understands it. The noise you hear when you disobey, that's not your guilt. That's the sound of the system panicking. Let it panic. That's how you know you're waking up. Because obedience doesn't die quietly. It tries to make you feel crazy first. It whispers, "You're overreacting." It reminds you of the comfort you once had. It seduces you with nostalgia, the peace of being small, unseen, accepted. But that peace was fake. It was just the calm of a chained mind. You'll feel lost for a while because for the first time, no one's giving you the script, and that silence will terrify you. You'll start to crave instruction, validation, direction, anything familiar. But resist it. That discomfort is your mind detoxing from control. Obedience is like a drug withdrawal, hurts, but clarity follows. Here's where strategy begins. You can't destroy obedience by fighting authority directly. That only strengthens it. Authority feeds on opposition. It needs an enemy to justify its existence. So instead of fighting it, you study it. You observe the pattern. You learn how it manipulates, how it rewards, how it punishes. You detach emotionally and watch like a strategist. That's where power begins, when you stop reacting and start observing. Because obedience thrives on emotion. It uses guilt and fear to keep you compliant. But once you can watch those emotions without obeying them, the control breaks. You become unpredictable, and nothing scares power more than unpredictability. A truly free mind doesn't rebel blindly. It bends the system strategically. It obeys when it benefits. It disobeys when it must. It plays roles, wears masks, stays silent when observation is smarter than confrontation. That's not submission, that's mastery. Because here's the truth: not all obedience is weakness. When it's conscious, it's camouflage. The Machiavellian mind knows when to bow and when to rise. Knows that sometimes the most powerful move is appearing powerless, that sometimes pretending to follow gives you access to what rebellion would destroy. This is the evolution from the obedient to the observer, and from the observer to the manipulator of obedience itself. You start to see how others can be steered, how obedience becomes currency in the social economy. People give it to those who seem confident, moral, dominant, and take it away from those who question or hesitate. Once you understand this, you stop being the one obeying and start being the one designing the rules. Because the secret isn't to destroy obedience, it's to own it. To make people obey you without realizing it. To learn the same psychological tactics that controlled you and use them for strategic influence. Watch how leaders speak. They never demand obedience directly. They create emotional loyalty first. They reward dependence, punish independence, and call it teamwork. They appeal to identity. You're part of something bigger. It's the same manipulation that raised you, only now you see the strings. And once you see the strings, you can pull them. You can use obedience as a mirror to understand the fears, needs, and insecurities of others. The ones who obey easily are the ones craving approval. The ones who resist everything are usually rebelling from old control. Once you learn to read these patterns, you can move people like pieces on a chessboard. That's what obedience really is, the study of human predictability. It's not about control. It's about understanding the emotional structure that makes control possible. And the moment you understand it, you become immune to it. Because obedience loses its power the second you see its mechanism. You can't be emotionally manipulated once you've mapped your triggers. You can't be guilted when you understand guilt as a tool. You can't be silenced when you've accepted the cost of being heard. That's the essence of self-mastery, not escaping control, but understanding it so deeply that it can no longer touch you. You start living by a different code. You don't react, you calculate. You don't seek permission, you seek leverage. You don't crave peace, you create it through power. Obedience taught you survival. Awareness teaches you dominance. The transition is brutal, but it's the only way to evolve. Because the world doesn't reward those who obey it, rewards those who appear to obey while secretly building their own empire beneath the surface. That's the Machiavellian truth hidden behind every system of control. They want you obedient because they fear what happens when you wake up. Because once the obedient begin to think, once they stop apologizing, once they start observing, they stop being followers and start becoming architects. And that, right there, is the moment obedience dies. Not with rebellion, not with shouting, but with quiet understanding, the kind that looks power in the eye and smiles, because it finally knows the game. Here's the cruel twist most people never notice. The ones who preach obedience the loudest are rarely obedient themselves. They obey publicly, and manipulate privately. They wear humility like a uniform while pulling strings behind the curtain. That's the paradox of control. Those who appear submissive are often the ones orchestrating everything from shadows, because obedience, when faked, becomes camouflage. It's how the clever survive among the powerful. It's how the powerless become indispensable. And that's where the reversal begins, when you learn that obedience can be a mask, not a chain, a weapon, not a wound. The truth is, society doesn't fear rebellion, it fears intelligence disguised as obedience. A person who obeys strategically, who pretends to conform while quietly gathering power, is more dangerous than an open rebel. Because rebels are visible and visibility is vulnerability. But the silent observer, the one who blends in, smiles, agrees, listens, that's the one who rises without being noticed. You've seen it before, the quiet employee who seems harmless, the one who nods while others argue, who stays late but says little. And then, one day, they're running the department. Not because they were the loudest, but because they mastered the illusion of obedience. That's the Machiavellian paradox. Sometimes the path to control begins by pretending to have none. Because while the world is busy trying to appear powerful, the wise are busy becoming it. They follow rules until the rules stop mattering. They play the part until they can rewrite the script. They obey long enough to understand the system from the inside, and then they use that understanding to bend it. Most people never reach this level because they confuse rebellion with strength. They think shouting is power, defiance is freedom, chaos is individuality. But raw defiance is just another kind of obedience, obedience to impulse instead of order. You're still reacting, still predictable, still controlled. Real power doesn't react. It designs. It waits. It moves like smoke, invisible, silent, everywhere. Here's the irony. When you truly understand obedience, you can use it as a strategy, a psychological disguise that protects you while you grow. You obey not out of fear, but out of foresight. You agree not to please, but to position. You nod not because they're right, but because silence buys you time. Every yes becomes a step forward. Every quiet moment becomes data. Every smile becomes a mirror for someone else's ego. This is what power really looks like, not dominance, but restraint. Not noise, but precision. And that's when you start to understand the deeper structure of manipulation. It's not always about controlling others. Sometimes it's about controlling your own visibility. Because power dies the moment it becomes obvious. The second people see it, they resist it. So, the most strategic move isn't to flaunt your independence, it's to make your obedience look believable. This is the hidden rule every successful manipulator lives by. The greatest power is exercised through the appearance of compliance. Think of the chessboard again. The pawn looks small, harmless, limited, but it's also the only piece that can transform. When it reaches the end quietly, strategically, it becomes the queen, the most powerful piece of all. That's the metaphor for silent ascension. You don't fight every battle. You pick your moves carefully, obey when it buys safety, and strike only when the timing is perfect. Because rebellion too early is suicide, but rebellion with timing becomes revolution. Here's the cruel beauty of it. When you learn to use obedience as a mask, people underestimate you. They project simplicity onto you. They open up, they reveal, they trust because they think you're harmless. And that's when you collect the truth, the information, the leverage, the map of the system. The moment you have that, you no longer need to fight for freedom, you can engineer it. Most people think control means dominance. But Machiavelli knew true control means invisibility. because when they can't see your intentions, they can't stop them. You must learn to use silence as your sword. Silence disarms arrogance. It makes the powerful reveal themselves, and the weak expose their fears. The obedient talk too much, but the strategic listen until the whole room gives itself away. That's when you start understanding manipulation on a surgical level, not as cruelty, but as awareness. You see how every interaction is a negotiation for control, how every compliment hides an agenda, how every apology is an exchange of power. And slowly, you stop reacting emotionally to any of it, because you realize obedience, rebellion, kindness, dominance, they're all currencies in the same economy. The wise don't moralize them, they use them. You stop asking, is this right or wrong? You start asking, is this useful or not? That's when you step into the realm of strategic self-mastery, where obedience isn't a cage, it's a costume. A costume you can remove whenever you choose. But here's the final paradox. When you reach that level of understanding, you no longer crave control over others. You start craving control over yourself. Because once you've seen how easily people obey illusions, you stop wanting to be the illusionist. You start wanting to be free from illusion itself. That's the final layer of awakening, realizing that power over others is still a form of obedience. You're just obeying your hunger for control instead of someone else's command. And if you don't master that hunger, it owns you the same way fear once did. That's why the highest form of power is self-control. Because when you can command your own impulses, no one else can. And when no one can command you, obedience becomes irrelevant. You move differently. You speak rarely. You act intentionally. You become a quiet storm, unpredictable, unshakable, untouchable. The world still expects obedience from you, but now you give it strategically, never emotionally. You've become what the system fears most. A person who understands both sides of the game. Because obedience isn't the opposite of rebellion. It's the mask that both sides wear to hide their fear of freedom. And when you finally take that mask off, the world won't understand you anymore. They'll call you heartless, distant, manipulative. But that's fine, because now you see them for what they are, still trapped in a game they think is real. You're not part of it anymore. You design it, watch it, and move through it like a ghost. That's the moment you realize obedience was never the lie. The lie was thinking you needed to belong. When the illusion of obedience finally shatters, something strange happens inside you. At first, it's not liberation. It's emptiness. Because for so long, obedience gave you structure. It gave you identity. Now, without it, you feel like a ghost inside your own life. You start questioning everything, every should, every must, every have to. You wonder, was that my choice or conditioning? You realize most of your life has been an echo of someone else's expectations, someone else's fears, someone else's idea of right and wrong. That realization hurts. It burns through every illusion you ever worshipped. But it's also the beginning of awakening. Because when the walls of obedience fall, you finally see the space beyond them, and that space is terrifyingly free. Freedom isn't comforting. It's raw, unpredictable, and silent. It demands you take full responsibility for every move, every mistake, every thought. There's no one left to blame, no authority to hide behind, no command to follow. Most people run from that silence. They crawl back to obedience because chaos feels too heavy. They'd rather be told what to do than decide who to be. But you don't run. You stand in it. You let the silence echo through you until it becomes familiar. You stop mistaking uncertainty for danger, and slowly, The noise of the world fades into background static. That's when you start hearing something else, your own voice. Not the obedient one that seeks permission, but the one that remembers power. The one that says, "You don't need to be told. You already know." This voice doesn't shout. It whispers. And when you finally learn to trust it, everything changes. You stop chasing approval. You stop explaining your decisions. You stop performing morality for people who never understood virtue. You start acting with precision, not out of rebellion, but out of clarity. That's the essence of psychological freedom, moving not because you're told to, not because you're reacting, but because you've chosen. Every act becomes deliberate. Every silence becomes strategy. Every boundary becomes art. You're no longer trying to be good in their eyes. You're trying to be whole in your own. And that's where the transformation deepens. Because the mind that was once enslaved by obedience begins to see the pattern behind every command, every manipulation, every demand for loyalty. You realize most people don't seek connection. They seek control disguised as love. They want you obedient so they can feel safe. They want your silence so they can feel superior. But the moment you stop obeying, you threaten their illusion, and that's when they turn on you. They'll call you cold. They'll call you arrogant. They'll say you've changed. But what they really mean is, you stopped being controllable. That's the price of self-mastery, losing the approval of the obedient. Yet, there's a strange peace in that loneliness. Because once you've walked through the fire of disobedience, you stop needing validation. You don't crave understanding, only truth. You don't need to fit in, only to see clearly. Your emotions become sharper, not louder, sharper. You feel anger without chaos, sadness without despair, power without arrogance. Because now, every emotion is yours. Not commanded, not forbidden, just understood. That's the shift from obedience to mastery. It's not rebellion for rebellion's sake, it's order by design. You begin to realize that real discipline isn't about following rules, it's about creating them consciously, wanting to be the illusionist. You start wanting to be free from illusion itself. That's the final layer of awakening, realizing that power over others is still a form of obedience. You're just obeying your hunger for control instead of someone else's command. And if you don't master that hunger, it owns you the same way fear once did. That's why the highest form of power is self-control, because when you can command your own impulses, no one else can. And when no one can command you, obedience becomes irrelevant. You move differently. You speak rarely. You act intentionally. You become a quiet storm, unpredictable, unshakable, untouchable. The world still expects obedience from you, but now you give it strategically, never emotionally. You've become what the system fears most. A person who understands both sides of the game. Because obedience isn't the opposite of rebellion. It's the mask that both sides wear to hide their fear of freedom. And when you finally take that mask off, the world won't understand you anymore. They'll call you heartless, distant, manipulative. But that's fine, because now you see them for what they are, still trapped in a game they think is real. You're not part of it anymore. You design it, watch it, and move through it like a ghost. That's the moment you realize obedience was never the lie. The lie was thinking you needed to belong. When the illusion of obedience finally shatters, something strange happens inside you. At first, it's not liberation, it's emptiness. Because for so long, obedience gave you structure. It gave you identity. Now, without it, you feel like a ghost inside your own life. You start questioning everything, every should, every must, every have to. You wonder, was that my choice or conditioning? You realize most of your life has been an echo, an echo of someone else's expectations, someone else's fears, someone else's idea of right and wrong. That realization hurts. It burns through every illusion you ever worshipped. But it's also the beginning of awakening. Because when the walls of obedience fall, you finally see the space beyond them, and that space is terrifyingly free. Freedom isn't comforting. It's raw, unpredictable, and silent. It demands you take full responsibility for every move, every mistake, every thought. There's no one left to blame, no authority to hide behind, no command to follow. Most people run from that silence. They crawl back to obedience because chaos feels too heavy. They'd rather be told what to do than decide who to be. But you don't run. You stand in it. You let the silence echo through you until it becomes familiar. You stop mistaking uncertainty for danger, and slowly, the noise of the world fades into background static. That's when you start hearing something else, your own voice. Not the obedient one that seeks permission, but the one that remembers power. The one that says, "You don't need to be told, you already know." This voice doesn't shout, it whispers. And when you finally learn to trust it, everything changes. You stop chasing approval. You stop explaining your decisions. You stop performing morality for people who never understood virtue. You start acting with precision, not out of rebellion, but out of clarity. That's the essence of psychological freedom, moving not because you're told to, not because you're reacting, but because you've chosen. Every act becomes deliberate. Every silence becomes strategy. Every boundary becomes art. You're no longer trying to be good in their eyes, you're trying to be whole in your own. And that's where the transformation deepens. Because the mind that was once enslaved by obedience begins to see the pattern behind every command, every manipulation, every demand for loyalty. You realize most people don't seek connection, they seek control disguised as love. They want you obedient so they can feel safe. They want your silence so they can feel superior. But the moment you stop obeying, you threaten their illusion, and that's when they turn on you. They'll call you cold. They'll call you arrogant. They'll say, "You've changed." But what they really mean is, you stopped being controllable. That's the price of self-mastery, losing the approval of the obedient. Yet, there's a strange peace in that loneliness. Because once you've walked through the fire of disobedience, you stop needing validation. You don't crave understanding, only truth. You don't need to fit in, only to see clearly. Your emotions become sharper, not louder, sharper. You feel anger without chaos, sadness without despair, power without arrogance. Because now, every emotion is yours. Not commanded, not forbidden, just understood. That's the shift from obedience to mastery. It's not rebellion for rebellion's sake, it's order by design. You begin to realize that real discipline isn't about following rules, it's about creating them consciously. You still live within systems, but now you move differently inside them. You obey laws, but not expectations. You respect people, but not their illusions. You play the game, but never forget it's a game. This is the quiet revolution of awareness. It doesn't need a stage. It doesn't need applause. It just needs stillness. Because when you're truly awake, you don't need to dominate anyone. You don't need to prove power, you embody it. Power becomes your natural state, not because you conquered others, but because you conquered the instinct to obey blindly. That's what separates the ordinary from the sovereign. The ordinary obeys because they fear consequences. The sovereign obeys only when it aligns with their inner law. That's the final form of disobedience, choosing what to obey. You become your own authority, your own compass, your own command. And from that place, life looks different. Every person you meet, every rule you encounter, every demand that comes your way, you no longer see it as pressure. You see it as data, information to navigate, not commandments to follow. This detachment gives you something priceless: calm. Because now, you're no longer at war with the world. You simply understand it. And once you understand it, you stop fearing it. That's when the last illusion dies. The belief that obedience ever kept you safe. It never did. It just kept you small enough to control. Now, you don't chase safety. You cultivate strength. You don't seek permission. You create alignment. You don't wait for direction. You move with intention. That's the point where most people will never follow you. They'll see your peace and mistake it for pride. They'll sense your control and call it manipulation. But you'll know the truth. Peace is just power without noise. And that's when you finally understand what Machiavelli meant when he said, "Power is not given. It is taken one decision at a time." Because obedience doesn't end in one act of rebellion. It ends in a lifetime of quiet choices, moments where you say no to the noise, yes to awareness, and everything in between is silence. That silence is where power lives. It doesn't shout. It doesn't ask. It simply is. And that's when obedience stops existing, not because you destroyed it, but because you outgrew it. There comes a moment, quiet, subtle, almost invisible, when you realize you no longer need to fight for power, because the fight itself was part of the trap. For years, you were taught to choose between obedience and rebellion, between submission and defiance, between silence and noise. But both sides were cages. Both were forms of control. The real freedom was in stepping outside the game entirely. You start noticing it in small moments. When someone gives you an order and you no longer feel the impulse to resist or obey, you simply observe. You weigh the command, not with emotion, but with awareness. You ask yourself, does this align with who I am? And if it doesn't, you walk away. No guilt, no explanation, no performance. That's not rebellion, that's sovereignty. Because true power doesn't scream. It doesn't defend itself. It doesn't need witnesses. It just is. You begin to see that obedience was never about rules. It was about identity. Every command you ever followed was secretly shaping how you saw yourself. And every disobedience that terrified you was actually a door to authenticity. Now, those doors no longer scare you. You walk through them effortlessly. You stop mistaking obedience for morality and rebellion for strength. You realize both are tools to be used, not lived in. This is the paradox most people never reach. You learn to obey selectively, not because you have to, but because you choose to. You learn to submit strategically, not to people, but to principles. You learn that control isn't about domination, it's about direction. And slowly, obedience stops being your instinct and becomes your instrument. You use it to move through systems, to navigate structures, to observe the psychology of the world around you. But inside, you remain untouchable. Because once you've tasted inner freedom, no command can ever own you again. You can play any role, wear any mask, follow any rule, but none of it defines you anymore. You've stepped beyond identity, beyond fear, beyond obedience itself. And in that stillness, you begin to understand why so many fear freedom. Because it's not comfortable. It's not predictable. It doesn't come with applause. Freedom means isolation, but also clarity. It means responsibility, but also mastery. You start noticing the obedient everywhere, their nervous laughter, their desperate need for validation, their hunger to belong. And you feel no anger toward them, only understanding. Because you were once them living inside the script, believing obedience made you good, now you see what they can't. They aren't obeying people. They're obeying fear. Fear of rejection, fear of failure, fear of being alone in truth. But the moment you stop obeying fear, the world starts obeying you. Not because you command it, but because you've aligned with something deeper than power, something silent, something timeless. That's the secret every strategist, philosopher, and manipulator eventually learns. The greatest form of control is not over others, but over your own reactions. When you master that, no one can provoke you. No one can guilt you. No one can own you through approval or fear. You move through manipulation like smoke through fingers, untouchable, shapeless, free. People will still try to pull you back. They'll test your silence. They'll tempt you with comfort. They'll try to make you kneel again through love, through fear, through loneliness. But none of it works anymore. Because once you've seen obedience as illusion, you can't unsee it. You've stepped outside the structure. You've entered the space where power doesn't dominate, it observes. Where silence isn't weakness, it's strategy. Where control isn't taken, it's designed. And in that space, something inside you changes forever. You stop needing to prove strength, you start embodying it. You stop chasing recognition, you start watching patterns. You stop being reactive, you start becoming inevitable. You move slower. You speak less. You think deeper. And in that stillness, you feel it, the quiet hum of self-command. It's not loud, but it's absolute. And that's when you finally understand the full truth. Obedience was never the chain, it was the test. The test of whether you'd choose comfort or consciousness. Most people choose comfort. They obey because it's easy. You chose awareness, and that choice is irreversible. So when they ask you, why don't you obey anymore? You'll smile, because the answer doesn't need words. It's written in your presence, in your silence, in the way you move like someone who answers only to truth. Because power doesn't need permission. Freedom doesn't need validation. And obedience was always the lie. And that's the cruel beauty of power. It doesn't shout. It watches. And it always remembers.